Hello, and welcome to the podcast, to the Less is More Education podcast with your host, Steve Flores. And this is episode 21, Recruitment and Preparation. And in this episode, I'm going to take a look at Empowered Educators, Recruitment and Preparation portions of the book. And I wanted to go a little bit more into detail and get into like what's in there and kind of take in some extra research that I did about California itself to see, all right, how can we improve things? So let's start off with a question. And this question goes to all of my teacher friends. How did your education experience begin? Right? So what was the first step in becoming a teacher? That first step, a lot goes into that. That's what we call recruitment. And so what is recruitment? Recruitment is how do we get teachers like interested and involved in becoming a teacher. So here's how I started. I started off by working off in industry, and in industry, I felt like I was not being challenged enough. And honestly, like my work didn't have that much meaning to it or behind it. I just kind of went in, did the same thing every day. Didn't really know why I was doing things. But I just woke up one day and I was like, all right, 6 months of my life have gone by. I feel like I haven't made any significant changes. This is kind of scary. This is what the rest of my life is going to be like. So I decided to fall back on taking my hobby at the time, which was tutoring, and then turning it into my career. And I know a few people that have taken that career path as well. Some people decided that they were going to be a teacher like from the get-go, from graduating high school, I want to go become an elementary school teacher. I'm going to go to school, become an elementary school teacher, right? Other people take a more circuitous route like I did, in that you go try something else and then teaching kind of becomes your fallback option. And teaching was not my first option, my first choice, because I basically knew one thing about teachers and when I was entering into college, and that's that they didn't make a whole lot of money. Not only did they not make a whole lot of money, I also got the feeling that they weren't really all that respected in as far as like career choices. And there was like all these sayings, especially back in the day, those who can't teach. And so there's like this stigma to becoming a teacher. And that stigma plays into recruitment, right? So who wants to be a part of a career where you don't get paid much? Sure, you get paid, you get summers off, but the consequence is you're going to be putting in like 50 to 60 hours a week when you are teaching. So it kind of works out to being the same amount in total of work and effort, and you aren't very well respected. So what's up with that, right? So let's take a look at this idea of recruitment. So what I did is I walked into Cal State Fullerton, their education college, and I was like, I want to be a teacher. They said, all right, what do you want to teach? And I said, oh, well, chemistry. That's what I did my undergrad in. And they were like, okay, let's get you started on that. And from there on, I didn't know it, but I was kind of put in a VIP lane. And I'll talk about how I kind of discovered this later on. All right, so recruitment. Let's start off with, well, who wants to be a teacher, right? Currently, how does it stand? How does California stand in here, or just the United States in general? And what I'm going to take two pieces of information and kind of meld them together into letting you know like where people are at in terms of choosing teaching as a career. In 2015, the ACT put out a report. So if you don't know what the ACT is a test that you can take that will get you admitted into college, right? So it's like sets the bar for what kind of colleges you can get into. It's kind of similar to the SAT. So ACT, SAT, those two are kind of interchangeable. So in 2015, they put out this report called The Condition of Future Educators. And in 2014, the previous year, they took a look at, all right, who are all the people that took the ACT? And we had 1.9 million students take the ACT in 2014. So that's roughly about half of all the students that were graduating that year. 88,000 of these 1.9 million, which is a very, very small portion of them, wanted to be teachers. And of these 88,000, 3,700 wanted to be specifically a math or a science teacher. So we're looking at very, very little interest from students graduating out of high school that want to become teachers. And only 20, and here's like the more heartbreaking part of all this, is if you look at those 88,000 students, only 20% of them met the benchmark for ACT's reading, English, math, and science components of their test. So we're not necessarily getting like the students that are interested in teaching aren't necessarily the best at least test taking. And it's still unknown as to whether or not they become good teachers because they struggled in high school. But that's where we're at. That's the information that we have right there. The next is going to be coming from the University of Pennsylvania's Consortium for Policy Research and Education. I know it's like a mouthful, but they put out a report in 2018 called Seven Trends, the Transformation of the Teaching Force. It's a really interesting report. It has, it basically looks at how the teaching force in the United States is looking like. So there, one example is they say that it's going to get much grayer, meaning that the teachers on average are getting older and older. But one of the trends that they're looking at is that the teaching profession is ballooning, meaning there's a lot more people actually going into education. And this is for a wide variety of reasons, and it's hard to pin down why we're getting more and more teachers. And so some of the reasons that they could come up with that they could actually attach numbers to were graduation requirements were changing. So because graduation requirements are changing, that usually means that more and more classes or teachers are being hired to fill in the graduation requirements that are usually tied to getting into a university. So for example, in in California, we have our graduation requirements kind of shifted in the early 2000s to being in line with what are called A through G requirements. So A through G is the classes that you need to take in order to be admitted into a Cal State or UC in the state of California. So what a lot of schools did is once they put out those A through G and once that demand for sending students into college got, raised, then a lot of school districts switched their graduation requirements to matching A through G, right? So they're pretty much like one and the same for a lot of school districts. And because of this, that means that the schools had to get more teachers to fill in those requirements. So whereas before, maybe you had 20% of the students like choosing to go on and take biology, now close to 100% of students need to take biology because that's a prerequisite to get into a state college in California, at least. And the same happened with math requirements, with English requirements, with history requirements. And so all these requirements kind of like made the districts want more teachers to fill in those spots to meet all those requirements. Another possible reason that they took a look at was that there was a huge increase in special education teachers and English language learners or teachers that focus on English language learners, or sometimes they're called bilingual educators or teachers. There was a big push towards increasing those needs, particularly in California. And finally, there was a push for smaller class sizes in elementary. So in California, I think this is still the case where if you can get your, I think this is for first, second, and third grade students or classes, if you can get those classes to, it's either below 20 or below 25 students, then your school gets extra money from the state itself. So all those things are kind of pushing like the hiring of more teachers. So you actually look at the amount of teachers that have been going up, right? So I think since I think the report looks at like kind of compares 81 to 2016, 2017, I think around there. And they look at trends in those like 30 years to try and make predictions as to what's going to happen in the future. And in that time, I think the amount of students has increased something like 20, I think it was like 30% or so. And the amount of teachers that have been hired that have been hired over the previous amount was like 60%. So we have 60% more teachers and 20% more students. And a lot of those teachers are specialized in English language learners and bilingual teachers. All right. And so we have a huge demand and we're hiring more teachers. So what do those two pieces of information tell us? Well, they tell us that that there isn't a lot of interest. So a lot of the people that are going into teaching are people that went into industry or went into some other line of work, left for whatever reason, and then came back into teaching. So teaching was not their first choice, essentially. That was not my first choice either. But there's some positives to that, in that a lot of people are probably leaving like their industry positions because they're getting more meaning out of teaching. That's a big reason why I left, is that teaching provided for me a lot of meaning in my life. And, and that was like pretty profound. And so there's also a small subset of teachers that, always wanted to be teachers, right, from the get-go. And so we have like the very passionate, but those only account for like a really small amount. And I remember, if you remember like in high school, my memory of high school is that I could take all my teachers and put them into one of two categories. Like, one is the teachers that are just trying to get through the day, right? They just see it as a job. And the other ones, which is a smaller amount, like in my high school experience, I only remember like a couple of teachers being like this. Shout out to Miss Frosto and her Shakespeare class, that they were just really passionate about their subjects, and they took that passion and then pushed it out to their students, right? There wasn't that many teachers that I had in my personal experience that were like that, but they were very memorable, and I enjoyed those classes a lot. And I still remember a lot of my lessons on Shakespeare and Hamlet and Othello and all that just from that class. And I think it had a really meaningful impact on the way I think about things in the world. So those are like kind of like where the teaching force is at now in California. So what does the world stage have to say about recruitment? That's the big question. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at empowered educators. They look at 5 different jurisdictions. So they look at Australia, Canada, Finland, Shanghai, and Singapore. And one of the things to note about recruitment is that recruitment starts with the reputation of teaching, right? That's true here. That's true around the world. That's true anywhere. That's true with anything that is popular out there. What's the reputation? And that matters a lot. Teaching currently in California, bad reputation. Teaching in jurisdictions where their education systems are really effective, that's not the case. And it starts off, honestly, in my opinion, with pay. So in those 5 jurisdictions, teachers make anywhere between 90% to 105% of similarly trained graduates. That's going to be a hard one for me to say, or to put out there, a hard word. So how does California compare? Well, California's teachers make about 85% of similarly trained graduates. So we're not quite there yet. So here's some examples of how they do it. There's a couple of different ways you can do this. Singapore ties their teacher salaries to the salaries of civil service engineers and accountants. And that scales, again, with time. So, the longer you teach, the more pay you get, or the more education that you have, the higher pay you also get. They also do like different roles. And I'm going to go and do a whole separate podcast on that later on. Another way that you can do it is you can just base it on the averages. So in Ontario, Canada, they try to set their pay to being competitive with all graduates that have like a university degree and a little bit of education on top of that, to the point where in 5 years, teachers are in the 75th percentile of those graduates with a university degree, and after working 10 years, they're actually in the 90th percentile. So their pay like goes way up with time, and that pay is one part of the recruiting process, right? So if you want a prestigious job, it better come with prestigious pay, right? And that's how you recruit like the best candidates. The other part of prestige is exclusivity. So if anyone can do something, it ain't all that special, right? So most people could, jump, right? You can just like jump off like a step or whatever. And so when we see somebody jump off a step, is that special? Not really, right? However, if you see like I don't know, a 12-month-old jump off a step, that's way more impressive. Why? Because 12-month-olds are not that good at even walking. So seeing one jump off a step is pretty impressive. So there's this thing about exclusivity that makes people want to jump in. And you probably remember this, like if you were in, around college age and trying to get into like nightclubs and stuff. You would see that the clubs that were, the best or had the best reputations were exclusive. They were willing to have somebody stand at the door and say, you can get in, but you cannot get in. And there's like it's pretty obvious who can get in and who can't get in, right? So that exclusivity actually increases the reputation of teachers. So how do you increase exclusivity? Exclusivity is actually like also a part of how hard it is to actually get in. So here's an example. So in Finland, only 1 in 10 primary school teacher education candidates get in. And in order to get in, they have to pass an application. They have to do free response essays, written out tests, and they do in-person interviews. In Singapore, you have to pass a CV screen, a 3-hour written exam, which is one of like the most intense ones that I saw of these jurisdictions, in-person interviews. And then on top of that, while you're in the program, you're constantly getting monitored, right? So that's the other big thing. The other big thing that I saw that actually kind of helps out with the prestige is kind of like lowering barriers to like financial barriers, but keeping the barrier of ability high. So most of these jurisdictions either made your teacher preparation program free or they would give you a stipend. In Singapore, for example, you start earning your teacher pay the moment you get accepted into a teacher program, right? Now, the bad part about that is if you don't complete the program, you have to pay all that money back. But most teachers, because they've passed that intense first part, actually stick with teaching. So not very many of them have to wind up paying that money back. So that's recruitment in a nutshell right there. So again, to recap, number one, you want to, for recruitment, you want to increase the exclusivity, and you want to make the reputation of teachers greater. How can you increase the reputation of teachers? Well, pay them competitively and be exclusive. A lot of what we've done in California is kind of like the opposite. We're starting to accept in underqualified teachers. I think if the last time I looked, in 2019, they put out a report of like how many underqualified teachers, and you could probably look this up. And it's something like 2/3 of the teaching force in California is underqualified. It is pretty like dismal and bad out there. So it's ironic to me that if you actually make it harder to become a teacher, you not only get more recruits, you also get a better quality, a better pool of recruits. So that could be an answer to the teacher shortage right there. Next that I wanted to look at was preparation. So how do we prepare teachers? In my experience in getting prepared for a teacher, I went through a 2-year program. The first year was a lot of classes and tests. And this is one of the things that I found really interesting is that we take a lot of tests here in California, a lot, right? We take tests throughout our elementary education. We take tests in middle school. We take tests in high school, and then they try to say like, oh, don't worry about these tests, we're going to make them low stakes, whereas before the scores determine how much money your school will get. We're going to get rid of that component of it. From everything that I've read and all my research, that doesn't even seem to matter. The whole reason why there's even a test there to begin with means that the state doesn't trust the people working in it or the students that are in it, or anyone. Doesn't trust teachers, doesn't trust the schools, doesn't trust the whole school board, right? Like all this testing is having a detrimental effect on everyone involved. One of the cool things that I saw in preparation, and I'll go over this in some of these jurisdictions, is that there's very little like formalized testing like that. So let's say I wanted to become a teacher. The way I did it was through an externship program. Not all programs involve like an externship or an internship. You can go through other routes to become a teacher, but I went through an externship program. Actually, all in all, there's like 9 different ways to become a teacher in California, which is kind of intense. But my first year was taking a bunch of classes, some classes on early childhood development, on pedagogy, on bilingual education. And then throughout this, I had to take a bunch of tests. I had to take the CBEST, I had to take the CSETs, and as well as like, I think I had to take a bunch of CSETs. I think I took all in all like 4 or 5 different CSETs. And then that was followed by the next year where I had an externship in which I was given a reduced load. So I think I was a 3/5. So to be a full-time secondary school teacher, you had to teach 5 classes, right? So I only had to do 3, but it was an intense 3. I think I had chemistry, I had honors chemistry, and then I had a combo class of AP and IB chemistry, which is really intense because I didn't even know what IB was, right? So talk about like underqualified. I was very underqualified to take on that job. But, like I said before, I didn't know it at the time. California was struggling to find teachers, so of course I got put to the front of the line for that. I probably had no business being in there. And so while I was going through the program, the second year, I had to take classes at night, doing pedagogy and how to write lesson plans. And God, let me just take a little offside here. The way we do lesson planning here in the United States, from everyone that I've talked to or heard from, and teachers, not just in our state, but in other states, is bonkers to me, right? Like the expectation from the university professors is that we're going to write like, these 10 to 15 page lesson plans for every lesson that we're going to teach in our careers, right? And the amount of time that you would have to put into that would be insane. Most teachers do not write these lesson plans. They just don't. We don't have enough time. So I don't really know why we do that. The other thing is some of the things that we get taught in our teacher programs aren't like kind of have been disproven sometimes, right? So when I was going through, there was this whole idea of multiple learning modes, right? So you could be like kinesthetic or audiovisual or but that turned out to be not true too. So there has to be a lot more research done. I think this is a 2 big problems. Number one, university professors don't spend a whole lot of time in the classroom. And that is a big problem. And that is probably why a lot of what they teach is kind of like outdated or not up to par. Number 2 is there isn't a whole lot of research being done in teacher education programs. And I'm going to talk about that later on with some of these other jurisdictions where they do actual research from the universities, where university professors are also at least part-time teaching in the classroom, right? And that grounds their teaching. All right. So it was pretty tough. Like, let's say you wanted to become a primary school teacher. So I looked this up on the CDE website, and there's like a bunch of different steps to becoming a primary school teacher. I was just interested in this. So number 1, first off, there's like a bunch of different routes. This is just one route. So one route is, this is just called the university route, is you have to obtain a bachelor's degree, right? It doesn't really specify what you should get your bachelor's in if you want to teach primary school in California. However, if you read later on, it's probably a good idea that you get a certain bachelor's degree, liberal studies degree. You should probably do that because it's going to meet a bunch of requirements in the future. So first, you need a degree. Second, you need to meet the basic skills requirement. And this is where like the two options start to come in. In every step that I saw in here, you could either meet the requirement by taking a simple test or doing a bunch of classes. Now, some teaching programs will just require you to do both. That's what mine did, right? So I not only had to take these classes, I also had to pass the test. So it's really up to the discretion. And so that makes it very ununiform, like the way the quality of teachers that come out of different universities. But the basic skills requirement means you either take the CBEST, which is a test that's on basic like math, reading, writing skills. It's very easy. Or if you score above a certain amount on the CSU Early Assessment Program, SAT, or ACT. So if you get a high enough score, you kind of meet the requirement already. Next, you have to take a subject matter competence. So you have to show that. And again, this is either take a test or take a bunch of classes. So the tests are called CSETs. The classes are anything that's approved by the Commission on Teacher Credentialing. So this is CTC, if you want to look it up later. And so you have to look at all the requirements. And again, these requirements are kind of met if you have a liberal studies degree or something that involves multiple subjects. Once you do that, then you have to take another test, right? So this is like, if you're doing the testing route, this is like the third test you have to take, called RICA, which is Reading Instruction Competence Assessment. And you have to take a course on the provisions and principles of the U.S. Constitution, right? Then once you're done with all of that, you have to apply for your credential with your program sponsor. They have to approve you. And then once you do that, then you have to pay a bunch of money and you get your teacher credential. And then if you want your teacher credential to kind of like be reapproved every, I think it's like 5 or 10 years, then you have to pay the CTC money. That's it. You don't have to take more classes. You don't have to prove anything. Just pay them $75 and then they'll re-up your teaching credential for another, I forget if it's 5 or 10 years, which I don't really know what the point of that is other than to extract money from teachers, right? All right. Now that's one route. You can also do another, like the shortcut routes. And there's a bunch of these independent programs like Teach for America. Teach for America will allow you to bypass all of that by taking a 7-week course. That's it. And then once you take your 7-week course, then they send you into a disadvantaged and academically struggling school. So they send you to like literally like the hardest schools to teach at. And then you get to be a teacher just like anyone else that had completed an entire program. That is bonkers to me. And that's why we have something like 60% of our, or like 30% of our teaching force that's like, that's underqualified. So, or maybe it's the other amount, but it just blows my mind. So how good is Teach for America? I just kind of looked this up. They had a high attrition rate. So only like 40% of their teachers or 40% of their teachers leave after 2 years and 64 leave after 4 years. So that was by like the most current numbers that I could find. So it's not a very good program and it's very wasteful because you have to constantly invest more and more resources in replacing all the teachers that leave. So does that sound like a good idea? Probably not. All right. So that's the California in a nutshell there. So what do we learn from this is you can bypass a lot of the steps if you're really good at taking tests. And again, like I said earlier, most classes are taught by university professors that have quite a bit of distance between them and actual classrooms. So the expectations coming from university professors don't match with the real life, like what you have to do day to day of an actual classroom. And here's one other thing that we're going to look at later on is not a lot of these programs foster cooperation or promote clinical training. If you want any kind of clinical training, then you have to get involved in an extern or internship program. Otherwise, you're going to have very limited experiences in an actual classroom, right? It's still expected that you go observe classrooms, but that's not the same as what we consider clinical training in the world sense. And I'll get into that later on. So why is all this important? Like, preparation is deeply connected to attrition. In California, 88% of the teacher demand is because of attrition. It's just people leaving the profession, which is kind of crazy. And I think a lot of this preparation, because it's not really hands-on, right? It's not clinical training, then it's, it's kind of like the difference between saying you can do something and actually being able to do it, right? And I have this experience, okay, when I first started seeing like kids flossing in class. So flossing, it's a dance. I was like, oh, that doesn't look too hard. That looks easy. And then I tried to do it and, kind of wound up throwing my back out. And, my wife, I'm pretty sure, started a Bumble account after that. Like it was horrible, right? That's just a joke. But yeah, that's like, there's a real big difference between, seeing something and learning about it theoretically and actually going off and doing it. So on the world stage, let's take a look at what effective jurisdictions do. So one of the assumptions that a lot of these programs do is like, if you can actually get into a program, then they're just going to assume that you have the ability to learn how to teach, which is really good. Really, like, that's a really positive mindset. Not a mindset that we have here, right? Where everything's like, oh, we got to test you, we got to test you, we got to confirm, got to test you, got to test you, got to confirm, because we're not sure about you. So it removes a lot of the friction of testing, right? And so it's not to say that they aren't tested; they're just tested in different ways, more in like practicum ways and holistically, in order to get their credentials, or what would be equivalent to a credential. So they set high standards. They have a lot of clinical training. There's a big emphasis on cooperation and ongoing learning, which I'll cover in a separate podcast. But if you take a look at the standards for most of these countries have like 3 basic categories. So, for example, in Ontario, Canada, if you look at their standards of teaching practice for the teaching profession, they have some standards in 3 broad categories: professional knowledge, so what should you know; professional practice, what should you be able to do; and leadership in learning communities. So again, that's that cooperation so that you can continue to grow as a teacher. Australia is very similar, right? They have the Australian Institute for Teaching and School Leadership, and they set out their standards, which is in 3 basic categories. Tell me, do these sound familiar? Category 1, professional knowledge. Category 2, professional practice. Category 3, professional engagement. And so these aren't all that unsimilar to the standards in California. So the California teaching standards, we have 6 of them. And standard 1 is engaging and supporting all students in learning. Standard 2 is creating and maintaining effective environments for student learning. 3 is understanding and organizing subject matter for student learning. 4 is planning instruction and designing learning experiences for all students. 5 is assessing students for learning. And then 6, developing as a professional educator. So those are the standards. In my teaching program, we kind of like go over them briefly, what each one of them means. And there's not a whole lot of actually going off, teaching this, coming back, and running through the process of this. It's more like, all right, here's a form that has all of these things, fill it out, right? That's what it's kind of like paint by numbers, which is kind of not the best. One of the things that I don't like about our CSTP standards is that there's no like there's a cycle that's implied, but it's not reinforced, right? It's all in how you implement these in your teacher program. So a lot of these other jurisdictions, they'll have cycles of teaching. And so here's an example. For like Finland, their cycle goes, all right, plan, action, reflection, evaluation, and then you start back at planning. So they kind of go through this process so that your teaching doesn't get stale. And they run through this process while you're in the actual program, while you're teaching students for limited amounts of time so that you can, get some good practice in. Australia has the MTeach program. So that's gather evidence, create learning strategies, use evidence based on interventions, and evaluate. And then it's another cycle right after that. And they give you time and the ability to get this hands-on practice with this, which is really important. So how do they give you the hands-on practice? So let's go back to Finland. Finland requires you to have clinical placement, 3 clinical placement periods, right? So that means times where you're actually going into a class with actual students and you're teaching in front of them. And it's really cool how they do it because you go through your whole teaching program with a partner, somebody else that's also going through the program, and you co-teach together. And when you go and take over temporarily a classroom, the permanent teacher is also there giving you feedback and helping you out. And you're also given support by somebody in the university. So there's 4 people involved so that you're never doing anything on your own. And that's how they foster cooperation. It's like you're never alone. You're never doing things alone. And that really spoke to me when I was reading about this, because for me, a lot of my education process was like very isolated. I was just by myself most of the time. And to see that in other jurisdictions, that the norm wasn't to be by yourself. The norm was to have other people around you so that you all support each other in growing, was very special, very amazing to see, and kind of inspiring, to tell you the truth. So 2 of these placements in Finland have to be done at training schools. Training schools are like the most awesome thing I had ever heard of. And it's kind of like training schools that we have here in the United States for medical doctors, right? So if you go to a lot of these medical schools like USC or in UC San Diego or UCLA, they all have actual hospitals connected to them so that their doctors or can actually go and try out what they've learned and get some actual hands-on knowledge. In Finland, they have these schools called training schools. These training schools are pretty cool. A lot of research and education takes place at these training schools. These training schools are connected to an actual university, so it's like if we had Cal State Fullerton Training School, it would be run by Cal State Fullerton, and it would have a space, right, in their curriculum so that candidates that want to become teachers can actually go over there, teach in front of live students, come back and like actually apply what they've been learning in the theoretical level. And so there's this interconnection between your theory and your application. And that's really missing here in California. And it's pretty vital. They also have, because it's run by universities, a lot of the teachers at the teacher training schools, they're held to even higher standard. And a lot of them are very accomplished teachers, teachers that have published, that have written books, teachers that have been teaching for a long time, teachers that teach other teachers. So it's pretty cool to see how respected the teachers at these teacher training schools are. And so that plays out, and that's how you get your hands-on experience. In Australia, they have the school centers for training excellence. Australia's moving towards, all right, instead of having just a diploma and then getting your credential, they're moving more towards a requirement to have a master's in order to teach. And the master's programs are expected to have like these school centers for teaching excellence. So this is like a training school, essentially. It started in 2010 to foster innovative clinical practice in initial teacher education. And if you go through these master's programs, you spend 2 days a week in a semester at an actual school, actually teaching and working with students. And then this is later on followed by a 3 to 4 week block placement at a school where you take over a classroom for a period of time. and then you come back and you kind of reflect on what just happened. So you get to like dip your toes in the water before being launched into there, right? Whereas my externship program was just like, all right, here's a bunch of theory, now go, right? And it was really intense, and it was either sink or swim, and I did not enjoy that. But the teachers that actually go through this, they're invited by the faculty to be a part of faculty meetings and to be a part of learning team meetings. And so there's like this very like inviting culture, right? Like, we're going to invite you into our school. We're going to invite you to be a part of all the components in the school. And again, that's to foster that cooperation so that you're not just so isolated by yourself in your own classroom most of the time. So some big lessons that we learned here. Why am I talking about the preparation to begin with? Well, preparation is really important because teachers that have appropriate preparation suffer way less attrition. So here's from a technical report called Teacher Shortages in California, Status, Sources, and Potential Solutions. So this was written by Linda Darling Hammond. Man, this lady is prolific. She's very prolific. But in the report, she writes that teachers not designated as highly qualified under the federal law are nearly twice as likely to turn over. Right? So there's that's a big reason for teacher turnover. And then later on in the report, I'm just going to read this straight out of the report. It says, these findings suggest that while California teachers are not generally dissatisfied with their immediate work in their schools and districts, those who work in more challenging contexts are less satisfied, and there are concerns across profession about the status, this is what we were talking about, status of the profession and the respect with which the teaching is held. This signals the long-term work needed to support teacher recruitment and retention. Status. That is what teachers want. That's what they're aching for, is status. We want to be treated as professionals. But that's a two-way street. It's not just that we want the status, but we as teachers have to take responsibility for that and be trained like professionals. It might not be a bad idea to require all teachers in the state to get a master's and to grandfather in old teachers so that we're not getting into like this realm where we're pitting, young teachers against old teachers, right? And maybe even inviting older teachers, reducing their loads, keeping their pay high, and allowing them to take on these mentorship and use what they've learned throughout the years to kind of lift the younger generation of teachers up. That would be beautiful. That would be amazing. That would be worth doing, right? And so that's the key idea, is like, we got to improve this cooperation. They're also, learning to be a teacher is very difficult. And if it can be done in an inviting environment, then all the better. Why not? Right? And there has to be space and time that's being provided, especially towards new teachers. This sink or swim strategy that we have here is not working out. Like, the teacher attrition rate is really bad here in California, as it is everywhere else in the United States. And we need to change our mindset of that, right? Do we want teachers to stay? Do we want them to be of high quality? Then we should set the standards high, right? And we should train them as such. And we should invite them in. We should welcome them. We as teachers are very compassionate people. And I don't think it's too much of a jump to ask to invite these younger teachers in and help them out in their teaching career. And that might mean reducing their loads, right? I think as a profession in total, we should reduce our loads. The average amount of hours per week that an American teacher spends in front of their students is 27 hours. That's much, much higher than the OECD average of 19 hours. And most of these jurisdictions that I'm talking about are even less than that. So why not reduce the load for them? Why not have them teach like only 3/5 and then give them that extra support, and maybe give some time to the older teachers to mentor them and to develop them, right? And to root their teaching strategies in actual practical strategies. And so that would be amazing if we could do that. And so teachers that feel prepared are going to be more likely to stay. So if we can just do that, right? Increase the prestige of teaching, right? Increase the standards of teaching, and make sure that we retain our teachers, right, through all this process, then I think that'll take us a long way in California in improving our schools. And that has been it. I appreciate you guys listening. And if you really want to help me out, like and subscribe to the podcast. You can also reach out to me. My email is going to be at lessismore.education@skift.com. You can find me on Instagram and YouTube at lessismore.education, on Twitter at lessismoreeduc1. The website is lessismore.education. Financially helping me out would be like the most helpful thing that you could do. And it'll cost you literally a coffee a month. Buy me a coffee a month. That's what I'm asking for. If you'd be willing to do that, it would be, you can find me on Patreon at patreon.com/lessismoreeducation. And if you want to, maybe you know somebody that's not into podcasts, but they're into reading, you can find all my writing at lessismoreeducation.substack.com. Thank you very much. I appreciate you listening to me. Have a great day.